Through the Noise with your host, Ernesto Glucksmann.
All right, Dr. Storey or Nate, how you doing? Thanks for coming by on the show, man. You are the co-founder and chief scientist over there at Plenty, and you guys do some really cool stuff with vertical farming, and give you a sense of where I've been on that front. It's just something that I've heard happening, and I've seen concepts fly through my Instagram here and there, but you guys are like, this is definitely happening. And this to me seems like it's the future. It's the cutting edge. I don't know, maybe for you, it's everyday stuff, but could we maybe start with a little bit of an introduction of what you guys do at Plenty and the service and the products you have?
Yeah, you bet. So Plenty is an indoor farming company. And by indoor, I mean completely indoor. So, traditionally indoor farming was greenhouses, but, greenhouses have their limitations. And what we've done is we've overcome those limitations by bringing the plants completely indoors. So in our farms, their sole source of energy, their sole source of light is artificial lighting. And so we've built LED systems and power distribution systems and all of the things necessary to grow plants basically in giant warehouses. And that allows us to control the experience of the plant completely, which means we can get maximum yield, maximum quality, the most flavorful, fresh stuff, and we can grow it right next door to where our consumers are. So that's primarily what we do. So we grow this food, but because no one has really done this before, we've also had to build all the technology that lets us grow it indoors. So we're kind of two companies in one. We're a growing company. We're also a technology development company.
So you do the grow part and you do the equipment part for designing the equipment. And when Charlene, one of our show producers, reached out, you guys sent back some, just some sample videos and things. And I just was telling you off mic, we're mostly an audio listening group, so you're gonna have to describe it. But what I saw was like, wow, it's like these, like, I'll take an attempt. It's like a wall of green, stuff you eat, and in these like bars that hang from the top, and then bars of LEDs that are also hanging. And you had a machine that actually helps kind of like place it up there, right? Because I presume you're not running up a ladder and starting from the top, seating everything. This stuff happens lower to the ground. And you need a machine that can kind of like flip the bar up and hang it up. Am I getting there?
Yeah. So I mean, for the sake of giving a framework for imagination here, if you imagine a library with stacks of books, except these stacks of books are say between 8 meters, 5 meters, and say 15 meters tall, depending on the farm. But instead of books on these stacks, there are plants, and the plants are pointing inwards towards the aisle that you walk down. And the aisles that you walk down, right down the middle of them, have all of these ducting for air, for treated air, and lights that hang down from the ceiling and basically light those plants. And the reason we have bookshelves is it's the most efficient way to organize books and also make those books accessible to people. And in our farms, we think about the most efficient way to organize plants and make those plants accessible to people, but also to give them the right amount of airflow, the right amount of light, and the right evenness of all of those different conditions.
And I guess the evenness is particular. I mean, the more you can control the environment, the more you can get, I guess, the plant product that is desirable, the characteristics of the plant that you really want, right?
Yeah.
And so how, I got to go back. How did you get into this line of work, the vertical farming?
That's a great question. I got into this line of work because my family's always had, direct or indirect ties to agriculture, and but I couldn't figure out really how to get into it in a way that made sense. And so that's kind of what launched me down the equipment design track. And equipment design led me to my first business, and the first business led me to my second business, and that's how I got here. I would say personally, I got into food production because I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, and I was living in China in this apartment building overlooking this village threshing floor, and I got to see agriculture up close and personal. And it's like most, personable in the most personable way, right? I watched the seasons, I watched the people come and go, the crops come and go, and I realized that growing food was pretty simple and straightforward and supposedly non-controversial. Although I've since learned that people can make controversy out of anything,
Right.
including just growing good food for people to eat. But that was kind of what personally got me started. So I ended up coming back to the States and did my bachelor's, master's, PhD in agroecology, which is the study of the ecosystems of agriculture. So the relationships between things in agricultural systems and natural systems, and then agronomy, which is crop and soil science. And that, during my research for my master's and my PhD, that's really when I started digging in on equipment and realizing the equipment didn't exist to do the things that I wanted to do. And it didn't exist to do the things that I felt like we needed to do, not just as growers, but as society.
But when did the vertical concepts start to kick into your mind? Because well, really, I mean, first of all, what were you doing in China there for the year?
Yeah, I was over there with an organization that taught English and trained folks in basically like good business practices. And without rabbit holing on how interesting like the late 90s and the early 2000s were in China, it's a time of massive structural change. And globally, we're seeing more and more of this kind of structural change across industries and politics and places. But in China at the time, there wasn't. They were inventing Chinese business, right? Like as we know it today at that time. And so we were over there working with folks that were trying to show business owners how to do good business.
And that's where you got inspired into potentially looking into agriculture in some particular way, or is that where the vertical farming concept started to also kick in?
That's where the values started, I think, or like kind of the decision to pursue that particular value. And the reality is kind of epiphanies are rarely epiphanies. Epiphanies are usually the product of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. It's like the harder I work, the luckier I get, kind of a thing. And that really resulted from basically digging in and doing the research back in learning, right? Like trying to understand the fundamentals of greenhouse growing, trying to understand the fundamentals of what has constrained the energy, and frankly, what constituted constraints for small producers. Because at the time, I was really just interested in figuring out how do we let smaller growers compete more? How do we enable smaller growers to build networks and to serve communities? I had half of the problem right, which was local ag is the future. I had the other half that I had wrong was trying to rely on thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of small business people to actually make that happen. That's a much harder problem to solve because you're solving for business acumen across a big group of people. So that was kind of what led me to Plenty. My first business was based on that idea, right? We small growers just need the tools to compete. They need the tools to network. They need the tools to meet their customers and their communities and provide value to those people. And what I realized was that's part of it. They also have to be really great at business. And so that's kind of what drove, jumping in with both feet and helping to found Plenty, was the realization that if we can concentrate that business acumen, if we can concentrate those abilities and scale a really great technology or technology suite on a really great platform in a really great market, then ultimately we can take local ag to everyone. And the benefits of that model are better nutrition, more accessible food, and people getting to experience flavors that they haven't experienced in a long time that ag can deliver on. And I think, ultimately it's a much more sustainable planet.
Okay. Oh man, there's so many spots to jump into, but one that stands out was the better flavor keeps coming up. Not just not just with the the work that you're doing, but I've talked to others that have they're like a company that grows mushrooms. They have a whole indoor growing machine that you
Yeah.
can put it into a restaurant or something. You can grow really intriguing mushrooms and just get them as fresh as you can. Is it simply because if you can vertically stack these plants and grow them, and you can then harvest them right there, and presumably you could take it next door to the restaurant down the street or whatever, that flavor is preserved, or you're able to let it ripen to the point where it can be consumed quicker, versus the massive scale agriculture where you got to go miles, you got to half the country, another country, you got to ship them in, and so you have to pluck them at a more, maybe when the product is a little bit more able to sustain the shipping process and the packaging and all of that. Am I getting there sort of?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the way to think about traditional ag is agriculture has freed us from starvation as a species, until relatively recently, like the first green revolution, actually a little bit before that. You go back to like the Haber-Bosch process, the ability to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, artificially create nitrogen fertilizer. So you take nitrogen gas, you split it, which is, a pretty hard thing to do, and then you make ammonia. And from ammonia, then you can make all sorts of other things that you can put into the ground that help plants grow faster. And nitrogen, for all of the history of the world, has kind of been like the limiting nutrient, right? The limiting element that plants need to build proteins and to grow and to reproduce. So you go back then, and that was like the first time where we took a big leap forward. Whereas a species, we kind of dodged a bullet on mass starvation when we figured that process out. And then you fast forward, about another 50 years, and we end up, in the mid 1900s, and the second green revolution comes around. And this is really driven by like Norman Borlaug and his work with wheat in Mexico, right? And he just took a couple of principles and then this crazy process called shuttle breeding, and that everyone else thought was nuts. They thought it would never work. It's crazy. Why are you wasting your time on it? And really kind of drove this massive effort that freed humanity again from the cycle of basically boom and bust, right? You have starvation every so many years. And he can be credited with both enabling the global population to grow, which people tend to get a little negative about. But when you consider that the way population in most species is maintained is by animals dying off, that is really, I think a good thing for people, right? So we enabled, the global population to grow. We freed all these calories that hadn't been free before, or had been free inconsistently, and we made it consistent. And so fast forward another 50 years, and we're still living off of the fat of that revolution. But it means that we have a very calorie-rich diet, and that calorie-rich diet means, it's good because we're not starving to death. It's bad because we're dying of other diseases now, many of them diet related. And at the heart of that is this idea of consumption and flavor, right? At the heart of that is that idea of flavor. And if you think of people as giant sensor systems that are basically optimizing for our growth and reproduction and the conservation of our energy to those ends, there's a lot of flavor and calories that appeals to kind of this prehistoric body that we're in. And so what we need to do with flavor is to come in and to replace a lot of the flavors that have been added to these calorie crops to get people to eat them, and to replace that with real flavor, with natural flavor, with the flavors that evolved alongside us, right? That made us as much as we made them. And so that's really kind of, I think, the opportunity in front of us. And I really view what we're doing as the second green revolution in two ways. One, we are freeing agriculture from the constraints of land and soil and inputs and the sun and space and distance and all of the things that place massive limitations on agriculture today. Two, we are also bringing back flavors that represent health and nutrition that our bodies crave, that our bodies will want. And we're making that available to people in a way that I think will make them healthier and happier and live longer. So the first revolution saved us from death by starvation. The second green revolution will save us from the death of dietary diseases, while simultaneously opening the doors to new levels of production. The global capacity for egg is going to go up again. And if you want to get really futuristic, I think it frees humanity again from a constraint that has been placed on it. It frees the land from a constraint that humanity has placed on it. And when I fast forward, into the future, I see land, a lot of agricultural land, which is, today we could argue is not the highest and best use of the land, but is a necessary use because there's a lot of mouths to feed. We can free ourselves from that constraint. And we can say, let's give that land back to the Amazon. Let's give that land, the Midwest, back to the buffalo. Let's give land, especially marginal ag land, that everyone would argue its highest and best use is fixing carbon. Its highest and best use is in natural habitat, is a home for wildlife and beauty and all of these other things that we love. It says that becomes possible in a way that hasn't been possible before.
Wow. Nate, that's quite the journey through this story. I mean, I think I'm intrigued by the fact that if you can kind of create the yields that you would get from a piece of land, you can create it in housed in a facility. You can protect that facility from all the things that you can see happening from climate variability. So, with variability with climate, and I've had folks on the show give me a few hints of that, comes things like pestilence and disease that can just, rip through entire regions, especially given the fact that we do have to scale agriculture. We do have to use a lot of land right now. And a lot of that is part monoculture issues, right? It's just more efficient to just, have acres and acres and acres of one type of plant, one genetic version of it, but it's not very resilient or adaptive when things start to, go haywire, as things have started to demonstrate that it can, and certainly is happening. So that's an intriguing solution that you have. So the question to you, and I guess I know what you're going to answer, but is how scalable is this? How does it compare to what we're doing right now? Can we really do this? I mean, you're doing it. I can see it's being done. There's a picture of it on your background. So for those that are not listening, you can't see this futuristic looking thing, but can you give us a sense of it, where you guys are?
Yeah, I think maybe the easiest way to explain where we're at today that helps people understand the future is through telling the story of two different things. One is the cost of land, and the other is the cost and efficiency of technology inputs, say something like LEDs. So to the first point, what I would say is Today, it is cheaper for us to build a farm, an indoor farm, than it is to buy acreage that can produce an equivalent amount of value. Meaning we've passed the point where it makes more sense to go buy land to do this kind of work, to create these kinds of products. And I would say we're still very early in the process of driving the cost out of the farm and driving the efficiency up. And so to tell you kind of what the future of the farm could look like, we can talk about LEDs. If we go back even 3 or 4 years, LEDs were about half as efficient, and they cost about 3 times as much. And so, as we move into the future, we see that LEDs are on this, what we call a cost curve, which makes them cheaper every single day in a predictable way, right? It's almost like Moore's law. And there's like kind of equivalent version of Moore's law for many technology inputs, where you can say the rate of improvement is actually highly predictable. And the rate of manufacturing efficiencies that we will achieve is also highly predictable, which means essentially for these inputs, we can see the future. We're fortune tellers, right? We can look into the future and see our future economics and the cost curve of those inputs. And that's true for inputs to our industry. That's also true at Plenty for our business, because we're basically we're the only grower in the space that has built a massive R&D organization, basically, to build our own cost curve, to drive costs out of the technology. And the reason we can do that is because we've invested in building a platform. So we started with a fundamentally different architecture. And in order to enable that architecture, we had to build some fundamentally different technology pieces that are assembled kind of into these products within the farm. And then we assemble those products together in unique ways to build the farm systems. And then we assemble those systems together in unique ways to create the farm itself. And then we modify or we tweak the farm to grow different crops. It's a different way of building this business than has traditionally been approached. Most folks have taken this system integrator approach, right, where we buy things off the shelf from here and there, and then we fit them together in a way that allows us to build a farm that works. And Plenty chose a riskier but a better path to say, we want our own cost curve. We don't want to just be dependent on the cost curve of our inputs. We want to be our own cost curve. We can incorporate those cost curves of inputs, but at its core, Plenty is on a path to basically drive an incredible amount of cost out of the system, an incredible amount of efficiency into the system, and then to scale the system across many different crops. So if you, going back to your first question, which was, where does this scale to? What are the limits? I would say the limits are pretty unlimited, meaning that, future capacity is constrained by the availability of land. And the question as to whether we should be using that land for that purpose at all is, I think, an important question for us to answer as a society. But ultimately, we will be able to build farms anywhere and everywhere, and we will be growing a massive amount of produce indoors. Today, the diet globally consumes about 1/3 of the fresh fruits and vegetables that it should consume. So, people are not getting enough nourishment in the forms of vitamins, minerals, the things that you get from fruits and vegetables. And we're capacity constrained as a world. The same gains that we've seen in grains, which are storable, we can ship them long distances, we ship them dry, so they have fewer spoilage issues. We can grow them on more marginal seasonal land versus fresh fruits and vegetables, totally different set of problems, right, to solve for with those different crops. And globally, we woefully underproduce. We produce 1/3 of what we need to. So the global market is 3 times what it is today. That's a $1 trillion+ market, right? And so we have a lot of growth ahead of us before we even begin to compete with the field. Which means, imagine all of the infrastructure that has gone into the production and distribution of fresh fruits and vegetables. And that ultimately is the market that we have to fill before we ever begin competing with the field.
Okay. Can you unpack that a little bit? Just give me some examples on that kind of you're targeting there.
Yeah. I mean, so we're starting with greens because they're nutritious. They also are something that can be really good when they're grown the right way. And they're, how nerdy do you want me to get here?
Go for it. I mean, you'll break my brain. I'll do the best.
Okay. So, it's easy to kind of like break plants down into these categories that helps you think about their efficiencies. So in any system, transferring energy from one form to the next or one place to the next involves an efficiency loss. And really all our farms are basically an attempt to minimize that efficiency loss from an electron to a molecule, whether it's like, a molecule of cellulose or a molecule of whatever, right? But we're basically taking electrons and turning that into chemical energy. We're doing the same thing in the field, except instead of electrons, we skip the electron phase, we go straight to photons, and it's just photons to plant material. So in our farms, greens are what we would call primary producers. We're selling the primary production of the farm, which is just the biomass, period. They're not producing seeds. And for these different stages of growth, there are efficiency losses as well. They're less complicated in some ways. They're more complicated in others. But it's a crop that is kind of like a good first candidate. And it's why you see most of the indoor farms focusing on things like greens right out of the gate. Now, the problem is that if you're building a system for greens, you're going to fail. Because greens, are a huge market, don't get me wrong, but they are a small part of the overall market. That overall market is, lots and lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, things that we can't keep growing in the field, say raspberries, right? Raspberries are under threat from all of these disease problems in the field that are just hard to beat. The microbes are winning the arms race, right? And the breeders are losing the arms race. Banana, right? They're in the same, bananas in the same situation. Also, crops that just suffer from supply chains. They don't do well being moved across countries and continents and oceans.
Strawberries and things like that. Okay.
Yeah, strawberries, things like that. So really what we've done is we've focused on building a system that works for greens, but also a system that we can grow strawberries and tomatoes and cucumbers and all these other things in. And so we've taken longer, we've invested more to build a platform, a true platform. An example of this would be like, we're working with Driscoll's on strawberries right now. Well, strawberries are an interesting crop. In the field, you basically mound up this long row and you cover it in plastic and then you punch the strawberry plants in and then the berries hang down, but they're not touching the ground. If the berries touch the ground, they're ruined, right? They'll rot. We've bred them for these like big, fleshy, delicious things that are full of sugar, which microbes, simple, fast energy, right? And so in the field, we've managed for it with a lot of control by just mounting these things up and keeping them, they touch plastic if they touch anything. In greenhouses, we grow in these long gutters and these long troughs, which allow them to just hang down in the air. So that protects the berries. In our systems, the berries can just hang out in space too, just like a gutter system. And that's important. In like other indoor systems, they would touch the raft, which would ruin them, right? And so you're stuck growing them in troughs in indoor space, basically. So you're limited to the format you can use. Well, the most important thing in indoor spaces is maximizing light interception, right? One of the main costs that we have, and really the primary source of energy, the only source of energy for the plants are these photons that are blasting out of our lighting fixtures during the day period. And so if we're blasting those onto non-photosynthetic, non-reflective surfaces, that's a bad thing because we're wasting money. We're turning money into electrons and electrons into photons, and then photons hopefully into something that we can sell to get money back, more money back than we put in, right? That's basically the equation.
Yeah.
And when we dump those photons onto plastic or into space or onto steel or onto something that doesn't produce something we can sell, we're basically wasting it and we're creating heat. which we have to pay to get rid of. And so in our systems, the towers that you see, they're actually spreading apart over the plant's life.
Hmm.
That's a mechanically tricky thing to do, but basically, we do that so that when the plant is small, it intercepts like 90. The growing plane will intercept 95% of the light, and then as it grows, it never intercepts anything less. It just stays at that number. Whereas if we fixed it in space, right, we'd miss half of the light we're shining at it. So half of our money we're just flushing down the drain because we're not.
So as the plant grows, you're moving the bar of light along with it. Is that what you mean by that, or?
The bar of light stays the same.
Okay.
And so like all of our lights are maximizing uniformity. So no matter where the plant's at in the array, it's getting the same amount of night light as its neighbors. But the towers themselves, so the plants are planted in these towers, and the towers are on a conveyor. They're moving down the conveyor, but as they move down the conveyor, they spread apart.
Oh, okay.
So they're basically, we're giving them more room to grow. We're giving them the ability to dynamically spread into space in a way that's natural, that keeps them healthy, that allows us to circulate air through the canopy, that manages all of these different environmental conditions.
That you couldn't easily do on the floor, on a table necessarily either, right? Or a conveyor belt, I guess.
Yeah, you can do it in a single layer. So like in a greenhouse or in a warehouse or something like that, you could do it in a single layer of gutters, but you can't do it in 2 layers of gutters.
Okay.
Because the economic efficiency of the farm depends on large planes, on really large growing planes. And as you break it into smaller and smaller pieces, like in a stacked system, you have to put in a lot more steel. You have to put in a lot more infrastructure to hold that stuff up. And for gutters like that, you start to break the plane in order to support the higher levels. And so this concept of breaking the plane is a really important one to understand. And this is going way too deep now, I realize. But we can't break planes. And so that is really like the beauty of our architecture, right? We can have massive planes, and we can have dynamic indexing, and we can stack 3 times as many plants into the same amount of space, and we can give air more circulation, and we can have our cake and eat it too, in almost every single sense, technical sense.
Dynamic indexing, that term that slipped by. What is that? What do you mean by that?
So that's the idea that we're spreading things apart.
That's
not like unit by unit, but dynamically over the plant's life. We're spreading the plants apart.
Oh man. So one question, like I guess the plants, and I don't know much about how much energy these plants convert, but it doesn't sound like it's a lot, right? From the actual light that hits it, there's a threshold to it, right? But and I guess if you had a field, you're only getting a certain set of hours of the sun running through it. Are your plants just getting light the whole time? Does that improve their absorption rate, or how does that work?
Yeah, it really depends on the plant.
Okay.
So, plants are, much, much older than us as a species, much more complicated. One way to think about it is, the human genome contains something like, 23,000 genes. Corn contains 55,000 genes.
There's more genes in corn. I just learned something new right there. Are you really?
Genetically, we're simpler than corn.
That's gonna upset somebody out there, I know.
That's gonna make a lot of people mad, including some plant breeders. That will spark a lot of argument. But consider that like one dimension of comparison, right? If we want to consider like complexity and the potential for edge cases, the way to think about it is plants have been around for a lot longer than us, and they've been solving more complicated environmental problems than even as a species we've had to solve, right? So
they've absorbed. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're just complicated things. They look simple, but they're complicated. And sussing out that maximum growth rate, sussing out, maximum flavor, sussing out perfection just requires a lot of control. And frankly, like control that we still don't have today. We're still working on this. This is a super hard problem to solve.
Is there some insights to the type of light spectrum or how much light?
Yeah.
I mean, do plants need not to have light for a period of time to also, I mean, not to say plants sleep, but have you are the lights on in your factories in these plants at Plenty all the time for their growth
Yeah,
stages?
that's a good question. And I realize now that I totally wandered off track with the previous question. Feel free to just like smack me back in line, just stop it, come back.
Okay.
That wasn't the right question. But yeah, again, it depends on the plant. So some plants we can run under 24 hours of light if we want, right? They don't care what time of day it is. Some plants don't like that. Some plants basically have the biochemistry of some plants requires that they have a dark period in order to move things around the plant, right? There's some things that just don't work as well. They're less efficient under light, especially like moving energy around the plant, right? As it does in the dark. There's some plants that have really very strong circadian rhythms, right? Where they change the metabolic rates throughout the day. And that can change from plant to plant. And so we either need to work with those rhythms or we need to defeat those rhythms, right? So we work with them or suppress and manage the plant for as consistent high efficiency as possible. There are some plants that could care less what conditions they're in. They're highly plastic, right? And we can put them in low light or high light in 24 hours or 12 hours of light. And, obviously, performance is always a product of energy input, right? So if you just break it down into its fundamental elements, we're putting energy into a farm, we're getting energy out in the form of chemical energy, diluted with a lot of water, and with some other nutrients added. But it's basically a function of how much energy can you pump into the farm, and how can you maximize that? Because that maximizes your throughput. So yeah, for some crops we'll run 24 hours a day, and so for some crops we would never do that because they would die. It'd be very sad.
Then and then some more questions on this. Like, does you have an array of LEDs, so you can, I presume it's almost probably somewhat trivial to program the light sources, whether they're on or off, or the intensity, or I guess even the color. Do you guys spend a lot of time sort of looking at how that can actually impact the output? I mean, obviously you don't want to throw photons on a plant that has a circadian rhythm and doesn't really want it, right? Because that's energy you're just wasting, right? So that's a clear area to try to figure out if you can do that. But on terms of like actually extracting the flavor profile, I mean, I would assume that it's probably more in the substrate or the dirt or whatever it is you're feeding it than the light, but maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, really. No, really. So the substrates that we use, there's kind of like, think of the plant as that there are kind of like the base operations, which scale really nicely with growth rate. But they don't deliver anything besides like just optimized machinery. Like if you think about the plant as a little factory, right? It's taking in photons and it's converting those photons into chemical energy. There's some things you just have to supply to keep the machines running, right? To keep that equipment going, to keep that efficiency high. So we can manage efficiency with some of that, with nutrition primarily and water. But the rest of it is really, the efficiency is really related to things like temperature and humidity and light and spectrum of light and duration of light and consistency of light. And, those are really the things that drive flavor in addition to plant genetics, more so than nutrition. I mean, a lot of people are surprised by that, but if the plant is healthy, the plant is healthy. Now there are some other things that we can do, right? Like we can shift the nutritional ratios to drive things in the plant. So, or we can change, say, like the EC of the water. So we can make the water saltier. And that can, in some instances, make the plants a little saltier. In some instances, it can cause stress to the plant in a way that ramps up flavors that humans like, right? So a lot of the things that we taste in plants are actually they're the product of either photosynthesis, right? This process of capturing light and converting it to chemical energy. They're the product of stress, or the plant is getting too much light, or there are other stressful conditions and the plant is trying to alleviate that stress. It's trying to, squash these runaway cycles, is trying to deal with photorespiration, whatever the thing is, right? And so it's really, environment is kind of more important to flavor in many senses than nutrient management, or to a larger degree. That's going to make a lot of people mad too. So I'm right now, I'm just pulling pins on grenades and throwing them out into the plant science world. And that my inbox is going to be full of hate mail after plant scientists hear this podcast. But
well, I just think that, there's the conventional incumbent way of doing things, and then we have the new toys to try. I mean, you do, but it's like I'm glad that there are people like you that are doing that and experimenting with it and trying something novel. Just on what we've just talked about in the last hour, it just seems like it'd be an endless, it's kind of like a really fine-tuned laboratory to experiment on what it is that we could actually even do, on top of actually growing these plants closer to the sources where you could eat, and in a controlled environment that's protected from the difficulties of the bigger outdoor space that we all live on, right? This planet. I mean, there's just so much so much possibility in my view, that you have to we have to pay attention, right? When do you think, like, I can't imagine big ag has much to worry about from you guys at this stage. Okay. But in the future, there's gonna be some blended aspect where then some thoughtful things will have to come together to figure out, well, how do we actually create both ecosystems on some level, right? How do we liberate some of the farmland that we don't really need to be growing every square inch? All of that. Like, where do you see that actually starting, that inflection point where that actually becomes something we have to really address, versus now it's just probably a lot of internet comments, just people arguing, I don't know, whatever. I don't know what it is. I don't know the controversies you find that get in the way for your work, but a lot of times just feel like it's just people arguing their ideology, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, we live in a world where everyone has an opinion.
Right.
Everyone thinks their opinion is equally valued, informed or uninformed as the next guy's. So yeah, I mean, I think we have decades of unconstrained growth ahead of us as a business, like unconstrained, as fast as we can build and bring farms up and sell product, especially as we begin to scale across crop categories. So I think we have decades of unconstrained growth before we, ever come into competition with the field. I think, in fact, we start to see many of the field producers migrate indoors, driven not by market conditions per se, but by environmental ones. And we're already seeing that in a lot of regions, right? I think we start to see a push for more sustainable agriculture, especially as people realize, we are clear cutting the Amazon to grow soybeans for pigs, for people. From an energetic standpoint, that is a terrible trade-off. From an environmental standpoint, that is a terrible trade-off. From the future of our species standpoint, that is a terrible, terrible trade-off. And I think as people begin to realize that is true, culturally, politically, as well as from a market standpoint, there's going to be more pressure to move towards systems that don't require that we clear cut the Amazon to feed people. So, we're already seeing it in kind of the alternative protein space. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to see a similar boom in the vegetable space, driven both by, climate change. It's not making it easy to grow outside, and driven by an uptick in consumption. So.
And I guess presumably also just simply like, oh, I got these greens from this type of growing system, and it's significantly different flavor profile, intensity than I can get from my supermarket. I want more of that, right? That's your kind of market play associated with some of this, right?
Right. I mean, we've trained people on iceberg lettuce, right? Which was bred the entire purpose of iceberg lettuce was to say, how can we pile a bunch of these heads in a train car and drive them across the country and take them out and then get people to buy them? Right? Like that was the entire value proposition that
But
drove.
not thinking about the nutrition or like the flavor. They're not thinking about any of that. It's just how can we make it deal with the ride down the road?
That's right. So that's kind of, that's kind of a far out example. But the reality is, the industry's been adapting to a global consumer base where the centers of consumption are very far away from the places where things are made, usually. And that's not driven things in consumers' favor. It's driven availability, generally speaking, in general categories, but it hasn't driven flavor. It hasn't driven quality. And really, since people started moving from the countryside into the cities, that was really like the last time most people on this planet got to taste really great. I should say, most people on the planet who live in cities now, which is increasingly most of the population, that was kind of the last time 2 generations ago, where they got to eat really good food. And they didn't have as much of it, and it was harder to come by, and it's more expensive, but it was really good. And we got to figure out how to give people really good food, but in a way that isn't really expensive, and in a way that isn't inconsistent. And that's why Plenty exists.
I would assume that this past year of dealing with COVID situations, and everybody that could at least create their own little victory or attempt to create their own little victory garden. A bunch of people probably figured out that it can be difficult, but it also can create stuff that doesn't quite taste like the stuff you get at the store. It's just, so I wonder if that's opening up new palettes for more demand for this kind of
I think so.
this stuff. What is it? I mean, what are your typical customers that come to you now? Like who's your sort of target zone at this time that would be intriguing to talk to for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're trying to sell into like the median. We say median organic, right? Like that's where we try to price it, right in middle of the pack on the organic, in the organic produce part of the aisle. And the reason for that is, we have a product that's pesticide free. It's distributed very, very soon after it's picked. It's got long shelf life. It has flavor that's better than anything else on the shelf. And I think it's sustainable. It delivers kind of all of the things that you're looking for in organic product, or like the actual value that people think is part of the organic produce value proposition.
You almost would, you don't, I guess, because they're in closed space, you wouldn't necessarily need a pesticide.
No.
If you
No
really
pesticides.
keep it clean and keep everybody going into the space from tracking something in.
That's right. I mean, when you walk into our farms, you gown up, you put on basically special shoes or booties, you put on gloves, you have face mask, you have a hairnet, you have a beard net. You're basically like contained from head to toe. So you're going in relatively, sterile. And the environment in there is relatively sterile. There's no birds that can fly over the crop and poop on it. They're not getting washed in big bins with the dead frog or whatever came in from the field. It's a totally different kind of farming.
And organic farming, I mean, I don't have a dog in that fight, but they use pesticides, they use herbicide, there's a class of, they have to. I mean, it's in the outdoors, it's gonna get a pest, it's gonna, you got to figure out ways to protect your crop, right?
That's right.
So you almost would need another category for your version of it.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about this. There isn't a category today. I think there will be someday. But yeah, it is a fundamentally different kind of product. It comes with a fundamentally different risk profile, right? You're not going to get E. coli from our product. There are limits that, on the risk that the product represents just due to how it's grown, right? We just grow it differently. We grow it in a way where a lot of these bad things just can't happen. We don't care about the weather. We don't care about animals. We don't have animals that can walk through the field. Processing is done like in the farm. The farm itself has SQF certification, right? So we actually certify the growing part of the farm to some of the highest, food safety ratings that there are. And we're able to do that because it's all contained, it's all controlled. We know what the temperature of that leaf is right over there, right? And we know what all the conditions through the farm are, no matter what, biologically and environmentally.
Holy shit. Wow. Okay. Is there like a client of yours that has this stuff that they ship? I want to try something. It's like I almost want to
Yeah.
try.
So, we sell at a number of Safeway stores in the Bay Area, as well
Okay.
as through a couple of other folks like Good Eggs and some other grocery stores. So if you go to our website, there's like a store locator type thing where you
Okay.
can figure out where we're at.
And that's the beginning. That's where you have how many farms do you guys have now? We're kind of working.
We basically have our small, what we would call like pilot scale farm in San Francisco. And we're in the process of building a farm right now down in Compton, LA that will produce, a lot more. So it will probably be, about 12 times as much production down in LA. And then, we're starting to plan the farm after that, which will be, twice again or larger the size of the farm in LA. So we've got a lot of growth. We've got a lot of to do.
Is the business model to sell the product, or is the business model to also sell the platform? So if somebody were to come and like, hey, I want to own one of these farms, but I want to do it over here in New York or DC, and I have a warehouse. Can we get together and make this happen? Is that a possibility, or are you guys not there yet?
I think we'll get there. I think, those types of relationships are harder than basically just building and managing your own facility. And so I think, we've got a couple cycles of learning where we're building the facility, running the facility, learning as much as we can from the facility, learning as much as we can about the markets, where we've got a high degree of control before we start to contemplate basically selling farms to other people.
Strategic farming.
Yeah. But we'll probably get there. Ultimately, again, we have to scale to 3 times the current size of all of the global infrastructure for fresh fruit and vegetable production.
To meet, where does that come from?
To meet today's need, right? So that's coming from the FAO, looking at fruit and vegetable production consumption around the world, and then comparing that to what we call the Harvard diet, but it's kind of like the recommended intake of fresh fruits and vegetables for people. Today, Americans are about 50%. So in the US, we only consume about 50% of what we should. In terms of fresh fruits and vegetables globally, it's more like 30%. And, we've got amazing purchasing power in the US, but we're really kind of playing in a zero-sum game when it comes to fresh fruit and vegetable production. That's not true in a lot of the ag space, but that's true when it comes to fruit and vegetable.
That those are the things that end up going through, I think, darker, scary storytelling of what's if we don't do it right, if we don't get there right. And I'm intrigued by the idea that this is scalable. It's like you're manufacturing the vegetables in a way, right? What's the next what's this footprint of this next facility that sounded like that got you excited? That's going to be a lot larger.
Yeah. So we're not talking too much about the specifics of that farm, but what I will say is, in order to do the same amount of business from the field, we would have to go buy around 720 acres to replace it. And the current farm is around 2 acres down in LA. So we're building about a 2-acre farm that we would have to go buy 720 acres to replicate.
Wow. In one building.
In one building.
Because we're
stacking it. Yep. If you want a fun exercise, it's not, you can't really do it over a podcast, but right. Basically just draw planes, with like 1 meter between them, 5, 8, 10 meters tall, however tall you want to go. And, and then calculate the surface area of both sides of that plane, and then imagine all of those stacked together, and you start to get to how the scaling works with this vertical plane technology, versus say stacking, right, where you only have one side of that plane that's productive. And you need lots of aisle space to get machinery and people and equipment in there. And that's just like starting to touch on the productivity. It doesn't even begin to touch on kind of the inferiority of trying to move air past non-productive boundary layers, trying to move, replenish CO2 and really manage that kind of a space, which we don't have time to get into. But
no, that's fine. But maybe another episode, Nate. One question: what are the plants grabbing onto? So I'll put a link in the show notes that they can look at some. Anybody that's curious can kind of click on and look at some of this. But what are they holding on? What are the roots sort of holding on to?
yeah, so we transplant them in this organic medium made of coconut coir. That's how we do it today. There are lots of options there. We started with like a peat product, and we've transitioned over to it's made out of coconut husk, ground up coconut husk. Basically, it's a nice renewable agricultural waste product that we can turn into anchoring for our little seedlings.
Okay. Wow. This is amazing. Thank you for giving us just a little window and taste of not actual taste at this point in time, but to get a sense of what it's like that you're in. I think you're in a really cool spot. That seems like there's so much there. It's like sounds like an endless universe of possibilities. So thanks for coming on the show, and I'm really excited to see where this goes. So please, can we do this again? Let's pop in again, and maybe we can dive into a specific plant, the story of one of the products. Maybe, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but if someone wants to find out more about you, if they're living in the Bay Area, that they, where should they go?
Just go to plenty.ag.
Plenty.ag. And are you looking for anything to help at this stage? Are you guys, career spots, anybody that's interested in working in this area or expertise?
Yeah. I mean, we're going to be building a lot of farms across the US over the next few years. And so people who are good with plants, who like to do simple, beautiful work, should get a hold of us and should keep an eye on kind of where we're expanding to. And then always looking for people who understand and believe in what we're doing, because we are building an entirely new kind of ag, an entirely new industry, an industry that's good for the planet and good for people. And that requires not just us to keep pushing on this thing, pushing this rock uphill. It requires that people around the world understand why this has to be true, that they understand that the fate of our planet and our species is at stake, and people who can believe and help support us in what we're trying to do. All
right, Dr. Storey, thank you so much. I think you did a little bit of that today, so I much appreciate it. Thank you. All right. And thank you guys again for listening. And yes, we have a YouTube channel. Yes, I'm still experimenting with the light and things. So if you prefer YouTube format, great, but don't expect much there yet. Thanks again. I appreciate it. Take care, guys.
For more episodes of Through the Noise, go to throughthenoise.us.